Cool. So I'm Abby Russell, as you've just heard, and I work at the University of Bristol in the Centre for Academic Mental Health. And I'm here today to talk to you about a project, a study that's just come out in the new issue of JCPP, looking at biological explanations for links between childhood adversity and later self-harm. And today I'm going to focus on the role of inflammation, and I'll explain what I mean as I go through. So this is the first study in a series, a 2-year programme of work that we're conducting at Bristol, and Becky Mars is the principal investigator on this, and these are all the fantastic people working on the grant. And the whole grant looks at possible biological mechanisms that underlie self-harm, as well as the genetic mechanisms that might underpin it as well. So, childhood adversity, or as you might have increasingly heard them being called, adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are indicators of household dysfunction and child maltreatment. So that means things like different types of abuse and neglect, as well as whether your parents have separated, or whether you might have experienced domestic violence as a child. And I did a quick search, you might have seen this if you've read my blog, at the number of publications that have used the term adverse childhood experiences in the title or abstract by year. And you can see that in recent years, the term is really going up in use. So hopefully more and more people are researching this, but also possibly everyone's just trying to save on word count by using a convenient acronym. But the term ACEs came from a study in the late 1990s conducted by Vince Folletti and Shanta Doob in America. And what they did was they used over 8,000 adults who were part of a primary care practice, and they all filled in a questionnaire asking about different childhood adverse experiences that they had had. And what Shanta Doob did and Folletti was link these with different negative health outcomes and causes of death. And what they saw was that the more different types of adversity a child had experienced or a person had experienced, the higher the likelihood of death by all these range of outcomes. You probably can't see them very clearly, but the one that we're interested in today is risk of death by suicide. So they were kind of the first people to use this term, but they're obviously not the first people to recognise that it's not particularly one type of adversity that might have negative impacts on health, but it's the cumulative impact of lots of types of adversity. And I know, obviously, in child psychology, Michael Rutter has been doing this for quite a long time. So adversity has been linked with suicide for quite a long time now, but let's have a look at some more recent research that explores this. So a couple of years ago, Karen Hughes published this systematic review in the Lancet Public Health that looked at the effect of multiple adverse experiences on different health outcomes. And what she found was that some of the strongest associations were for mental health outcomes, and particularly risk of death by suicide. This doesn't just apply to adults, so this group in Stockholm have shown that childhood adversity is associated with a higher risk of suicide in young people and young adults. And obviously, JCPP have something to say on the subject as well. So last year, Christine Cha showed that there was strong evidence that different forms of child maltreatment have predict future suicide ideation as well as suicide attempt. So there's lots of literature that links childhood adversity and dying by suicide. But there's also literature that links adversity and self-harm. So this is a study from the same group that looked at self-harm, finding that the more adversity people experienced, the higher their risk of self-harm in adolescence and young adulthood. There's also a systematic review that looks at non-suicidal self-injury that shows the same thing. So why am I talking about adversity when the title of my talk starts with biological mechanisms? Well, because early adversity is associated with this whole range of negative physical outcomes as well as mental health outcomes, it's a good candidate for what we call biological embedding. And that's exactly what it sounds like. It's when a psychological event becomes biologically embedded in a person and it can change their health over the life course. There's a really nice review on how this happens and the different mechanisms that might take place specifically around childhood adversity. And I'll just talk about a couple of them. So one is epigenetic changes, and this is where the molecules that physically hold your DNA in place in a certain structure are changed, and that might mean that different genes are switched on or off depending on where these changes occur. Another mechanism might be altered Hpa Axis Reactivity. So this is your fight or flight response. So if you're being chased by a bear, your Hpa axis kicks into action and it sets off this whole cascade of hormonal and neurological effects that can include impacting on your behaviour. And if you imagine a young person who experiences lots of adversity, their Hpa axis is going to be activated over and over again. And this could, over time, lead to changes in how your systems respond and changes in your biology. So another mechanism is altered neural structure and function. And I think with an audience that's interested in child psychology, it's not a big leap to say that we know that early adversity can impact on your brain development. And then what I'm interested in today is that early adversity could cause chronic inflammation. And when I'm talking about inflammation, I'm talking about activation of the immune system. And today I'm talking about systemic or baseline levels of inflammation, which is how active your immune system is generally on kind of a day-to-day basis. And you can measure this in a blood sample. So the immune system generally involves a whole load of different cells, molecules, and cytokines. And we'll talk about a couple of them specifically, but I'm not going to go too heavily into the biology today. So, experiencing adversity might impact on your immune system and your levels of inflammation, but how does this link with behaviour and self-harm and suicide in particular? Well, we know that the brain recognises signals from the immune system, and some of these inflammatory molecules can actually cross the blood-brain barrier directly and impact on neurotransmitters. This can lead to changes in mood and behaviour, and I think one of the nicest ways of kind of conceptualising this easily is to think about sickness behaviour. So if you have a group of people and you give them pro-inflammatory drugs which increase the activation of their immune system, in some of them you might see this cluster of symptoms that we call sickness behaviour. And it's kind of thought of as your body's way of telling you you're ill, you need to rest so that we can work on getting you better. But this cluster of symptoms includes changes in mood, including depression and suicidal behaviour in some individuals. So we can see that your immune system and inflammation can impact on your behaviour. So let's think more about the research that links childhood adversity and inflammation. And earlier this year, a review came out looking at this specifically in children and adolescents, but there have been studies that look at adversity and inflammation in adults going back a few years now. So the literature in adults shows that the more different types of adversity people have experienced in childhood, the higher levels of inflammation they have. And C-reactive protein and interleukin-6 are two of these inflammatory markers that have been most robustly associated with childhood adversity. You don't need to know much about them, but interleukin-6 is a largely pro-inflammatory molecule, and it triggers release of CRP, which is released from the liver. And the doctors in the room might know that CRP you often measure when you're looking at acute infections people have because it can spike 1,000 times. But you also have kind of baseline levels of circulating CRP in your bloodstream, which is what we're thinking about here. Now, in this meta-analysis looking at the literature in children and adolescents, this is the forest plot for CRP, which is very blurry. But I'll draw your attention to this blob here, and there's a dotted line there. And basically, the authors found that although there was some indication of higher levels of CRP if you were exposed to early adversity, it wasn't statistically significant. And then for interleukin-6, they also found that there wasn't evidence that this was increased in childhood. But like I say, the evidence is there for adults. And as a caveat, this came out after we did our paper. So that's linking adversity and inflammation. And inflammation has also been linked with suicidal behaviour and self-harm. So in a meta-analysis in 2015 of 18 different studies of adults, they found that blood levels of both IL-6 and CRP were significantly increased in people who had suicidality compared to those who did not. But the effect size estimates were quite small, so that's Hedges G there, and they're quite small effect size estimates, but they thought it was quite robust. There have not been many studies looking at this in children, but there were 2 studies included in this review by Kim in 2014 that looked at suicide in young people and inflammation. And one found that there were no differences in levels of IL-6, but the other found higher levels of 3 different inflammatory markers in children and young people. So we've linked adversity and inflammation and suicidal behaviour, but no one's actually looked at the 3 in the same context and explored whether or not childhood adversity increases your risk of self-harm through the pathway of inflammation, and that's what our study did. So I'm going to tell you about it. So we used information from the Avon Longitudinal Study of Parents and Children, or AUSPAC, And this is a birth cohort following children who were all born in the area of Bristol and Avon in 1991 and 1992. And originally there were over 14,000 children in the Ausbach cohort. In our study, we had information from 4,308 young people, and this was the number of young people who all attended a research clinic when they were 9.5 years old, and they gave a blood sample that the researchers could use to measure IL-6 and CRP, those two molecules I've been talking about. So we looked at the number of different adversities children had experienced before the age of 9 years old, and these were mostly reported by the mother, but also their partner and the young person. We measured IL-6 and CRP in those blood samples that I just talked about, and then we looked at self-harm, which was reported by the young person when they were 16 years old. As you can imagine, we had some covariates and intermediate confounders, which I'll talk about in a minute. We also did a series of sensitivity analyses, and this is kind of good practice in epidemiology to check that your findings aren't just because of the particular way you've measured something or the particular way you've conceptualized something. So we looked at self-harm in a couple of different ways, restricting it to people who had self-harmed with suicidal intent or those who had self-harmed more than once in the past year. These are the different adversities we measured. We had 9 of them, and they've been derived by Lotte Houtpen and Ausbach, so we used her measure. But they include sexual, physical, and emotional abuse, as well as parent substance use, serious mental health problems or suicide attempt, domestic violence, parental separation, whether the child was bullied, and whether the parents had a criminal conviction. And you can see from this that, unfortunately, childhood adversities are not rare. They are quite common. And when we looked at how many adversities children had experienced, you could see that only 1/3 of children experienced no adversity, and everyone else had at least more than one. So we considered that adversity was present in our study if the child met criteria that I've detailed here, but you don't have to read, any time before the age of 9 years old. And what I want to draw your attention to is the number of questions that were asked in Ausbach that went into making up each of these measures. So we've got really, really rich data that we're working from, and we can be really clear whether or not mothers have reported that the child had experienced it, or whether the child reported it as well. So in our mediation analysis, we looked at the number of adversities young people experienced and their risk of self-harm at 16. And we looked at whether that was mediated or explained by levels of inflammatory markers at 9.5 years old. Now, unfortunately, statistical analysis is not as simple as this in real life. So we had our 2 measures of inflammatory markers, IL-6 and CRP. And as I said earlier, IL-6 actually triggers release of CRP, so it doesn't make sense to look at them separately. We also had some intermediate confounders. Now, these are things that we thought could plausibly be caused by childhood adversity and that could impact on your levels of inflammation or self-harm at 16. So we had BMI and internalizing and externalizing problems that we measured from the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire. And then we had some covariates, so family socioeconomic status, maternal smoking during pregnancy, and child sex. The exciting bit, what we found. So we confirmed the association between adversity and self-harm, and this is a relative risk. And what it means is that for every additional type of adversity a child had experienced, they were 11% more likely, on average, to report that they'd self-harmed at 16 years old. We didn't find any evidence at all, however, that this was mediated by inflammatory markers at 9.5 years old. So you can see there the relative risk is bang on 1, with very little variation around it. In our sensitivity analyses, looking at these different definitions, we found pretty much the same thing, except for when we looked at those who had self-harmed with suicidal intent. And for this, we found that the direct effect was stronger, so the relative risk is now 22% more likely of reporting a suicide attempt but at the age of 16 for every additional adversity a child experienced. But still no evidence of mediation by inflammatory markers. This was my initial reaction to the results. But luckily for me, JCPP always have something to say. So why might our findings be what they are, and have we actually found that there is no association, or could it be explained by something else? So it could be that adversity impacts on childhood through an altered inflammatory response, rather than through baseline inflammation. So if a child got a virus, for example, maybe their immune response is heightened rather than it being baseline increases in inflammation. And that might be why we see this in adults but not in children, the higher baseline levels, if over time these altered responses might alter how our immune system works. It could be due to the timing of our measures. So our measure of inflammatory markers was quite early in childhood at 9.5, and that was so that we could be really clear that we were measuring inflammation before young people reported that they'd self-harmed. But most existing studies have looked at adversity as retrospectively reported by adults and then inflammation taken in a blood sample then. So we're looking at it in a very different way. It could be that prior studies are actually detecting the inflammatory consequences of self-harm, so that's open to exploration. And it could also be because we used a population-based sample. So most of the research in this area is on clinical samples who have either come to attention in hospital because they've attempted suicide or because they have serious psychiatric diagnoses and they've been recruited into studies that way, whereas we looked in the general population. And this is important because we know that self-harm is quite prevalent in adolescents and young adults, and the majority of young people who self-harm won't come to clinical attention. So in conclusion, young people who have been exposed to childhood adversity are a group at high risk of self-harm. But the association between adversity and self-harm does not appear to be mediated by an inflammatory process in childhood, at least not the way that we've measured it. So we need further research to identify other psychological and biological pathways that might underlie this relationship. And this is important because it's going to be really difficult to prevent everyone from experiencing any adversity. But if we can work out how that makes them at an increased risk of self-harm, perhaps it will open up pathways for intervening and treatment. So I'd just like to say thank you to you guys for listening, and to the ALSPAC team and participants and our funders. Thanks.